I've watched enough folks go through this life to know one thing for certain. The loneliest people aren't always the ones who live alone. They're the ones who've stopped expecting anyone to show up. And the bravest souls aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones who knock on a closed door anyway. I saw this truth prove itself once, years back, in a small cabin outside a cattle town in Wyoming. Caleb Mercer smelled wood smoke a quarter-mile from home. His hand moved toward his holster. 3 weeks on the trail had worn him down to reflex, and smoke from his own chimney meant someone had let themselves in. The cabin windows glowed amber through the dusk. No second horse, no fresh wagon tracks in the dirt. He swung down without a sound. The porch boards knew his weight and stayed silent. Through the warped glass, he saw the movement a woman's shape at his stove. Her back turned, stirring something in his grandmother's Dutch oven. On the table sat 2 tin plates. 2. His hand fell away from the holster. He reached for the door instead. If this story found you settling in for the evening, I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. And I know many of you have been enjoying these stories without subscribing, if you'd like to support our little community. That subscription truly means the world. The door swung inward. Heat struck his face, wood smoke, and something rich, meaty, familiar, in a way that made his chest tight. Clara Dunn turned from the stove, wooden spoon suspended mid-stir. Her calico dress was the color of faded cornflowers, practical apron tied at the waist. A strand of hair had slipped loose from her bun and hung against her cheek. "Mr. Mercer?" She didn't step back. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to thank you proper." Caleb stood in his own doorway like a stranger. The cabin smelled different, alive. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had cooked in that stove but him, and his cooking amounted to beans and coffee and whatever he could char over an open flame. "The door was unlocked," she added. "The back one. Latch is broken. You should fix that." He still hadn't spoken. His saddlebags hung heavy on his shoulder. 3 weeks of trail dust coated his clothes, his skin, the inside of his throat. "I'll wash up," he heard himself say. The basin sat where it always sat, on the stand by the window. He poured water from the pitcher, watched his hands move through it, brown rivulets running off his knuckles. Behind him, Clara's spoon scraped the bottom of the Dutch oven. The cornbread she'd made sat wrapped in cloth on the table. He dried his hands slow, turned. She was ladling stew into the 2 tin plates. Her hands stayed steady, but when she spoke, something caught in her voice. "I haven't cooked for anyone but Molly in 2 years." She set the ladle down. "I'd almost forgotten how much to make." Caleb pulled out his chair. The legs scraped against the plank floor, a sound he'd heard 1,000 times. Always alone. Now Clara Dunn sat across from him, smoothing her apron over her knees, not quite meeting his eyes. The stew steamed between them. Beef, carrots, potatoes, rosemary. His wife used to add rosemary. "You fixed my wagon wheel," Clara said. "Back in spring. The mud, the rain, I thought I'd be stuck there all night. You didn't say a word, just fixed it and rode off." Caleb lifted his spoon. The first bite hit his tongue, and something unlocked in his chest that he hadn't known was sealed shut. "You remembered that," he said. Clara's eyes finally met his. "I remember everything." 3 days later, Caleb woke before dawn and lay still, listening. Nothing. No footsteps on the porch. No spoon scraping against iron. No smell of coffee he hadn't made himself. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, feet hitting cold planks. The cabin held its breath around him. same as it had for 8 years. Same silence. Same shadows pooling in the corners where the lamplight never quite reached. But something had shifted. The silence felt heavier now. He noticed it in a way he hadn't before: the absence of another person's breathing, the lack of movement that wasn't his own. He pulled on his boots, walked to the kitchen. The stove sat cold and black. The Dutch oven had been washed and returned to its hook. Everything in its place. Except the table. 2 tin plates still sat there, side by side. He'd left them out after Clara departed that night, watching her lantern bob down the road until the darkness swallowed it whole. He'd meant to put the second plate away, meant to slide it back onto the shelf where it had gathered dust for years. His hand reached for it now. Fingers brushed the cool metal rim. He stopped. Left it where it was. The morning passed slow. He fed the horse, checked the fence line, split wood he didn't need. Every task felt like killing time, though he couldn't have said what he was waiting for. The cabin door stayed in his peripheral vision. His ears tracked sounds from the road: a wagon passing, hoofbeats fading, the distant bark of a dog somewhere toward town. By midday, he'd run out of reasons to stay. "Need flour," he muttered to no one. "Coffee, too." He saddled his horse and rode toward town, telling himself this had nothing to do with Clara Dunn. A man needed supplies, dear. Simple as that. The road stretched flat and brown under the autumn sun. Dust rose behind his horse's hooves and settled on his shoulders. His hat, the creases around his eyes. He passed the old Miller place, abandoned now, windows dark, and the creek where he used to water cattle before driving them north to market. Town appeared over the last rise. A single dirt street lined with false-fronted buildings. A church steeple poking up at the far end. The hand-painted sign for Taylor Mercantile swung in the breeze, its hinges creaking a rhythm he'd known for 20 years. He tied his horse at the rail. The water trough needed filling. He could see the low line through the murky surface. Someone had left a child's hoop leaning against the general store wall. Red paint faded almost to rust. Inside was the smell of pickle brine and tobacco hit him first. Hank Taylor stood behind the counter. White apron stretched across his belly, spectacles perched on his nose, barrels of crackers and salt pork lined the walls, bolts of fabric gingham, muslin, dark wool stood upright in wooden crates near the window. And there, running her fingers along a length of blue calico, stood Clara Dunn, a girl beside her 14, maybe, with Clara's same brown hair held a wicker basket against her hip. The girl's eyes flicked toward Caleb the moment he stepped through the door. Clara turned. Her hand paused on the fabric. "Mr. Mercer?" "Mrs. Dunn." Silence stretched between them. Hank Taylor made a show of rearranging jars on the shelf behind him, but Caleb caught the old man watching in the reflection of the glass. "Molly, this is Mr. Mercer." Clara's voice stayed even. "He has the ranch out past the creek." "Cabin?" Caleb corrected. "Just a cabin. No ranch." The girl Molly studied him with eyes too sharp for her age. "You're the one who fixed our wagon." "Your mother told you about that." "She tells me everything." Clara's cheeks colored slightly. She turned back to the fabric, though her fingers had stopped moving. "We're just picking up supplies. Molly needs a new dress for church. She's growing faster than I can sew." "Growing's what young folks do." The words came out rough, unpracticed. Caleb couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken to a child. Hank Taylor shuffled over, pencil tucked behind his ear. "You needing anything today?" "Caleb got fresh coffee in yesterday. Good beans, up from Texas. Flour too, 5 pounds. I'll get it wrapped." Hank disappeared into the back room. The silence returned, thicker now. Molly wandered toward the candy jars near the window, leaving Caleb alone with Clara in the narrow aisle between the fabric bolts and the pickle barrels. "I wanted to thank you again," Clara said quietly. "For letting me stay. For not—" She paused. "For not making it strange." It was strange. Her eyes met his. A flicker of something crossed her face. Loss. Maybe? Or recognition? "Yes," she said. "I suppose it was." The back door banged. Hank emerged with a paper sack of flour. A smaller bag of coffee beans balanced on top. "That'll be 40 cents. He set the goods on the counter, then leaned forward, lowering his voice enough that the words carried only to Caleb. "Mrs. Dunn was asking about you earlier this week. Wanted to know what kind of man you were." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And told her you were the quiet type? Keep to yourself? Decent enough when it counted." Clara appeared at the counter, laying down coins for her own purchases. If she'd heard Hank's words, she gave no sign. "Mr. Mercer?" She gathered her fabric, her thread, a small paper twist of sugar. "Molly and I are having pot roast Sunday. After church." She hesitated. "If you'd like to join us." The invitation hung in the air. Molly drifted back to her mother's side, basket now heavy with purchases, watching Caleb with that same unreadable expression. "I'll think on it," he heard himself say. Clara nodded once. "The cottage on Elm Street, white fence. You'll see it?" She gathered Molly with a glance and moved toward the door. The bell above it chimed as they stepped out into the afternoon light. Caleb watched them go, Clara's straight back, Molly's hand finding her mother's elbow, the way they walked in step like two people long accustomed to having only each other. Hank Taylor cleared his throat. "She asked me if you were a good man." Caleb turned. "What'd you tell her?" Hank pushed the flour across the counter, eyes steady behind his spectacles. "I told her you were, but that you didn't know it yourself." The words landed somewhere deep in Caleb's chest. He picked up his supplies without answering, walked out into the sun, and mounted his horse. He rode home faster than he'd come. The cabin waited, dark and silent. But on the table, 2 plates still sat where he'd left them. And for the first time in 8 years, Caleb Mercer understood he'd been waiting too. The question was, for what? Sunday morning, Caleb stood before the cracked mirror above his washstand and dragged a straight razor down his jaw. The blade scraped through stubble, revealing skin pale beneath the weathered bronze of his cheeks. He rinsed the razor in the basin, watched the foam swirl gray and dissolve. His reflection stared back a man he barely recognized. Clean-shaven, hair combed wet against his skull, eyes uncertain in a way they hadn't been in years. He'd laid out his good shirt the night before. Chambray, blue as summer sky, pressed flat under the weight of his saddle. He pulled it on now, buttoning slow, fingers clumsy on the bone buttons. The shirt smelled of cedar from the trunk where he'd stored it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd worn it. The leather vest came next, then his boots, brushed free of trail dust until they held something close to a shine. On the table sat a glass jar of honey, amber and thick, sealed with a circle of waxed cloth. Old Samuel Pratt kept bees in the valley south of town. Caleb had traded him 2 days of fence work for the jar last spring, meaning to use it himself. Never had. He picked it up, felt its weight in his palm. A gift. When had he last brought anyone a gift? The ride to town took 20 minutes. He passed the church just as the bell finished ringing, the congregation spilling down the steps in their Sunday best, women in bonnets, men in dark coats too warm for the weather, children running between the wagons, their laughter sharp in the still air. Caleb kept his head down and rode on. Elm Street sat 2 blocks past the Mercantile, a row of small cottages with whitewashed fences and narrow yards. He found Clara's place by the fence she'd described, white pickets, slightly crooked, in need of a fresh coat. A rocking chair sat on the porch. Hand-sewn cushion faded by sun. Curtains hung in the windows. The same blue calico he'd seen her touching at the store. He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post, stood there with the honey jar in his hand, boots rooted to the dirt. The front door opened. Molly appeared first, still wearing her church dress, white cotton with a ribbon at the waist. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him with that same unreadable expression. "You came?" she said. "Said I'd think on it. Mama said you wouldn't." Clara's voice drifted from inside. "Molly, let the man through the gate." Caleb unlatched the gate. The hinges squeaked a high, rusted sound that set his teeth on edge. He made a mental note to oil them, then caught himself. Not his gate, not his concern. The cottage smelled of roasting meat and rosemary. Clara stood at the stove, cheeks flushed from the heat, stirring gravy in a cast-iron skillet. The kitchen was small but clean, every surface scrubbed pale. A hand-embroidered tablecloth covered the table. White linen with tiny blue flowers stitched along the border. In the center sat a mason jar stuffed with wild flowers, purple asters, and yellow goldenrod. The last blooms before frost. 3 plates. 3 sets of silverware. 3 glasses filled with water from the pump. Molly had already set his place. Something struck him in the chest, sharp and sudden, like a horse kick he hadn't braced for. He stood in the doorway, honey jar clutched against his ribs, unable to move. "Mr. Mercer?" Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Please, sit down. Dinner's almost ready." He set the honey on the table. From Samuel Pratt, down in the valley. Clara picked up the jar, held it to the light. The amber glowed like captured sunlight. "Molly, look. We haven't had honey since Kansas. Can I have some on my biscuits?" After dinner, Caleb lowered himself into the chair. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Across from him, Molly settled into her own seat, hands folded on the tablecloth, watching him with eyes that missed nothing. Clara brought the pot roast to the table, ringed with carrots and potatoes, steam rising in a fragrant cloud. She carved the meat with quick, practiced strokes, laying slices on each plate. The gravy came next, ladled from the skillet, rich and brown. "Mr. Mercer, would you say grace?" The question caught him off guard. His mouth opened, closed. How long since he'd prayed? How long since he'd sat at a table with anyone who might ask, "I'm out of practice," he said. Clara nodded, no judgment in her face. She bowed her head, and Molly followed. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for the hands that prepared it, for the company we share. Amen." "Amen," Molly echoed. Caleb said nothing, but he found his head had bowed on its own. The meal passed in silence at first, forks against plates, the soft sound of chewing. Caleb couldn't remember the last time food had tasted this good. The meat tender, the potatoes soft with butter, the gravy rich enough to make a man forget his own name. Molly broke the quiet. "Mr. Mercer, do you ever get scared of the cattle?" He looked up, found her watching him with genuine curiosity. "No, never. I'm scared when they run." He set down his fork. "A stampede. You can't stop it. 1,000 head of cattle moving like water breaking through a dam. You just get out of the way and pray nobody gets caught underneath." Molly leaned forward. "Did you ever get caught?" "Once, down in Texas, years back. My horse went down. I rolled clear, but my hat didn't make it." He paused. "Took me 3 days to find another one. Rode into town looking like a fool." Molly laughed, a bright, sudden sound that filled the small kitchen. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, covering her own smile. "A cowboy without a hat?" Molly said. "That's like a preacher without a Bible. Worse? Preacher can borrow a Bible. Hat's got to fit just right." The laughter faded, but something warm remained in its wake. Clara watched him across the table, her expression soft, unguarded. After dinner, Molly excused herself to wash the dishes. Clara protested, "You cooked! I should clean!" But the girl waved her off with a firmness beyond her years. "Go sit on the porch, Mama. I've got this." Clara led Caleb outside. The evening air had cooled, the sun dropping low behind the rooftops. 2 rocking chairs sat side by side, and Clara settled into one, tucking her skirt around her ankles. Caleb took the other. The wood groaned beneath him, old but solid. For a while, neither spoke. The street lay quiet, most folks still lingering over their own Sunday dinners. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A wagon rattled past, wheels crunching on packed dirt. "Thomas was a good man," Clara said finally. Her voice came soft, almost to herself. "My husband. He worked hard, provided for us, never raised a hand in anger." Caleb waited. But he was distant. She stared at the horizon, hands folded in her lap. "Even when he was sitting right beside me, he wasn't really there. His mind was always somewhere else. Work, money, worries he wouldn't share." A lump formed in Caleb's throat. He knew that man. He'd been that man. "I told myself it was enough," Clara continued, "that I should be grateful. And I was. But when he passed," she paused, "I realized I'd been lonely for years, even with him right there." The words hung between them. Caleb gripped the armrests of the rocking chair, knuckles white. "I was the same," he said. The admission scraped out of him, rough as gravel. "With my wife, I worked, came home, worked more. She'd try to talk and He shook his head. "I was there, but I wasn't." Clara turned to look at him. Her eyes held no accusation, no pity, just understanding. "Do you think people can change?" The question struck deep. Caleb stared at his hands rough, calloused, scarred from ropes and fences and hard labor, hands that had spent 8 years alone because he didn't know any other way. Inside, Molly had started humming. A hymn. Maybe. Or a song from childhood. The sound drifted through the window. Gentle and unselfconscious. Caleb looked at Clara, at the cottage behind her, small and warm and alive. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'd like to find out." Clara smiled, not polite, not guarded. Real. And something in Caleb's chest cracked open. It terrified him. He wanted to run, to saddle his horse and ride back to his dark cabin and bolt the door. Instead, he stayed. But as he rode home that night, one thought kept circling. He'd been alone so long, he'd forgotten how to be anything else. What if wanting more only led to losing everything again? 2 months had passed since Clara first set foot in his kitchen. Tuesday became their day. Clara arrived at Caleb's cabin just past noon. When the sun hung high and the shadows grew short, she carried a basket over her arm, sourdough bread wrapped in cloth. Sometimes a jar of preserves. Once, a whole apple pie still warm from the oven. Caleb learned to listen for the creak of her wagon wheels on the dirt road, the soft whicker of her mare greeting his gelding across the fence. He started making coffee before she knocked. 2 cups instead of 1, the pot set to boil on the stove, grounds measured with a care he'd never bothered with when cooking for himself alone. "You're getting better at this," Clara said one afternoon, sipping from the tin cup he handed her. Steam curled between them, fragrant and dark. "Had a good teacher. I never taught you anything about coffee. You taught me it tastes better when there's someone to share it with." Clara looked down at her cup, but not before he caught the color rising in her cheeks. The visits stretched longer each week. An hour became 2, then 3. They talked about small things, at first the weather turning cold, the price of grain at the mercantile, whether the old Miller place would ever find a buyer. Caleb told her about the trails he'd ridden, the rivers he'd crossed. The time a rattlesnake spooked his horse and sent him tumbling into a creek bed. Clara laughed at that. A sound that filled the cabin's corners and chased out the silence that had lived there for years. She told him about Kansas, about the farm she and Thomas had worked, the droughts that killed their crops 3 years running, the fever that took him in the end. She spoke without self-pity, her voice steady, her hands busy with the mending she'd brought along. Caleb listened. He'd never been good with words, but he was learning that sometimes listening mattered more. One afternoon, he spread a worn leather hide across the table, covered with brands he'd drawn in charcoal. "This one's the Double Bar," he said, pointing. "Biggest outfit in the territory, and this here's the Rocking H. They run cattle up near the mountains." Clara leaned close, studying the marks. Her shoulder nearly touched his. "They all look the same to me. That's what rustlers count on." He traced a curved line with his finger. "But see how the Double Bar's got that extra notch. That's how you tell. Every brand's got something that makes it different. You just have to know where to look." "Like people," Clara said quietly. Caleb glanced up. Her eyes met his, holding steady. "I suppose," he said. She taught him cards in return, a game called Pitch that she'd learned from her grandmother back in Missouri. The rules confused him at first, all those trumps and bids and tricks, but Clara proved a patient teacher. She sat across from him at the table, dealing cards with quick, practiced hands, explaining each play as she made it. "You're letting me win," he accused after his third victory. I would never. You just threw away your ace? Clara's mouth twitched. Maybe I wanted to see you smile. He hadn't realized he was smiling. Couldn't remember the last time he had. The repairs started small. A loose shutter on Clara's cottage. Banging in the wind every time a storm rolled through. Caleb showed up one morning with his toolbox. And by noon, the shutter hung straight and silent. Clara brought him lemonade, tart and cold. And they sat on her porch while Molly practiced her letters at the kitchen table inside. The next week, he fixed the front step the board had rotted through, dangerous for anyone who didn't know to avoid it. The week after that, the roof. He spent a whole day up there under the autumn sun, replacing shingles, tarring the seams, while Clara handed up supplies and Molly watched from the yard with barely concealed fascination. "Mr. Mercer," Molly called up. "Are you going to marry my mother?" Caleb nearly dropped his hammer. Clara made a strangled sound below him. "Molly," Clara's voice came sharp. "That is not an appropriate question. Mrs. Patterson asked the same thing after church. I heard her." Silence. Caleb focused very hard on the shingle in front of him, driving nails with more force than necessary. Below. Clara gathered Molly by the arm and steered her inside. The screen door banged shut behind them. He finished the roof without coming down. The whispers had started weeks ago. Caleb heard them at the mercantile, caught the sideways glances after church. The widow and the cowboy. People talked. That was the way of small towns. Nothing stayed private for long, and folks with little excitement in their own lives found it in the business of others. Old Mrs. Patterson cornered him outside the feed store one afternoon, her voice pitched loud enough for the women nearby to hear. "Mr. Mercer, I see you've been spending considerable time with Mrs. Dunn. I've been helping with repairs. Her cottage needed work." "I'm sure it did." Mrs. Patterson's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Such a charitable man you've become." He tipped his hat and walked away, jaw tight, ears burning. But it was Molly's words that stayed with him. Mama smiles more now. The girl had said it one evening while Clara washed dishes, her voice matter of fact, as if commenting on the weather. Caleb had been sitting at their table, waiting for Clara to finish so they could play cards. The statement landed in his chest and lodged there, warm and strange and impossible to ignore. "She used to be sad all the time," Molly continued, drying a plate with slow, careful strokes. "After Papa died, she tried to hide it, but I could tell. Now she hums when she cooks. She didn't used to do that." Caleb had no answer. He sat there, hands flat on the tablecloth, while something shifted in the air around him. The rainstorm came on a Thursday in late October. Caleb heard the thunder first, a low rumble rolling across the valley like distant cannon fire. The sky had been gray all morning, heavy with clouds that pressed down on the land like a weight. By noon, the first drops fell. By 2 o'clock, the rain came down in sheets, turning the road to mud and the yard to a shallow lake. He was in the barn checking on his horse when he heard wagon wheels. Through the open door, he saw Clara's mare pulling up to the cabin. Clara herself hunched on the seat with her coat thrown over her head against the downpour. He ran out to meet her, rain soaking through his shirt in seconds. "Get inside," he shouted over the drumming water. "I'll see to the horse." He unhitched the mare and led her into the barn, rubbing her down with a rough blanket while the rain hammered on the roof above. By the time he made it back to the cabin, water streamed from his hair. His boots squelched with every step, and a chill had settled deep in his bones. Clara stood by the stove, feeding wood into the firebox. She'd already hung her wet coat by the door, and her hair had come loose from its pins, damp strands clinging to her neck and shoulders. "I was bringing bread," she said. "I didn't expect the storm to hit so fast." "You should have waited." "I didn't want to." The fire caught, flames licking up around the kindling. Caleb stood dripping on his own floor, watching Clara coax the blaze higher with practiced hands. The cabin grew warm by degrees, the windows fogging with condensation. Outside, rain hammered against the glass, turning the world gray and formless, sealing them inside together. "There's a book in my basket," Clara said. "Miss Avery lent it to me. Would you like me to read?" He should change his wet clothes, should hang them by the fire, put on something dry, make coffee to warm them both. Instead, he sank into the chair by the stove and nodded. Clara retrieved the book, leather-bound, worn at the corners, spine cracked from use, and settled into the chair across from him. The quilt his wife had made lay folded over the armrest. Clara pulled it across her lap without asking. A gesture so natural it struck him somewhere beneath the ribs. She opened to a marked page and began to read. Her voice filled the cabin, low and steady, weaving between the sounds of rain and fire. The story was about a man who'd lost everything and wandered the world, searching for something he couldn't name. Caleb listened with his eyes half closed, the warmth seeping into his bones, the words washing over him like water over stone. And he realized that home was not a place. Clara read. "It was the person waiting when he returned." She paused, looked up. "Who wrote that?" Caleb asked. "A man who lost his wife and found her again. In a way." The rain drummed on. The fire crackled low. Neither of them moved. "He was lucky," Caleb said finally. Clara closed the book, keeping her finger between the pages. Her eyes held his across the small space between their chairs. "No," she said softly. "He was brave." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, wasn't empty. It was full comfortable in a way Caleb hadn't known silence could be. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire burned low, and Clara began reading again. And Caleb let himself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to stop running from the thing he wanted most. When the rain finally stopped, long after dark, Clara gathered her things to leave. Caleb walked her to her wagon, helped her up onto the seat, his hands lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Next Tuesday?" she asked. "Next Tuesday." She drove off into the wet night, wheels cutting tracks in the mud. Caleb watched until her lantern vanished around the bend, a small point of light swallowed by darkness. He walked back inside, closed the door, and stopped. The book sat on the table. She'd left it behind. On purpose, he realized. So she'd have a reason to come back. He picked it up, held it against his chest, and smiled in the empty room. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a cold thought crept in. The town was already talking. And talk, in a place like this, had a way of turning ugly fast. The saloon sat at the far end of Main Street, wedged between the blacksmith shop and the livery stable. Caleb avoided it most days. Too much noise, too many people, too many questions he didn't want to answer. But his horse had thrown a shoe on the ride back from checking fence lines, and the blacksmith was backed up until evening. Nothing to do but wait. He pushed through the swinging doors and found a table in the corner. Back to the wall. The bartender brought him a whiskey without being asked. They knew his drink here, even if they didn't know much else about him. Caleb nursed it slow, letting the burn settle in his chest, watching the room through half-lidded eyes. A poker game ran at the center table. 4 men hunched over their cards, coins and crumpled bills stacked between them. Caleb recognized most of them. Tom Whitfield from the feed store, old Jake Brennan, who'd worked cattle before his knees gave out, a younger fellow named Peters, new to town, still trying to prove himself to anyone who'd watch, and Bill Grady. Caleb's jaw tightened. Grady was trouble. Everyone in town knew it. He ran a small outfit east of the creek, more ambition than skill, and a mouth that moved faster than his brain. He'd tried to get Clara to mend his work trousers a month back, then balked at paying up front. She'd turned him away at her door. Caleb had heard about it from Hank Taylor, who'd heard it from Mrs. Patterson, who'd heard it from someone sweeping their porch at the right moment. The way of small towns. Grady sat with his back to Caleb, shoulders loose with whiskey, voice carrying across the room like he wanted everyone to hear. "I'm telling you," he was saying, slapping a card down on the table. "The widow's got herself a regular arrangement out there, every Tuesday, like clockwork. Rides out to Mercer's place with a basket on her arm and a smile on her face." Peter snickered, leaning back in his chair. "What's in the basket?" "Bread," she says. Grady took a long drink from his glass, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "But a woman don't ride 3 miles in bad weather just to deliver bread. Not unless she's delivering something else along with it." The table laughed. Jake Brennan shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable, but said nothing. Caleb's hand curled around his whiskey glass, knuckles going white against the smudged surface. "You think Mercer's paying her?" Peters asked, grinning like a boy who'd heard his first dirty joke. "Nah, she's paying him." Grady leaned back, a mean grin spreading across his unshaven face. "Woman like that, widowed young, no man to keep her warm, she's got needs. And old Mercer, well, he ain't exactly turning her away. Is he? Maybe she's grateful for more than wagon repairs." The whiskey burned in Caleb's throat. He swallowed it down hard, forced his hands to stay flat on the table. "Walk away. Just get up and walk away." "Heard she cooks for him, too," Jake Brennan said quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes. "That's all it is. Just cooking and company." "Sure it is." Grady's voice dripped with mock sympathy. "And I'm sure they just sit there eating stew, all proper-like, while the sun goes down and the lamps burn low and nobody else around for miles to see what happens next." More laughter, louder this time. Tom Whitfield joined in, though his smile looked forced. Peter slapped the table. Caleb's vision narrowed to a single point, the back of Grady's head, the greasy hair curling over his collar. The way his shoulders shook with each ugly sound that came out of his mouth. "Tell you what," Grady said, reaching for his cards again. "Next time I need trousers mended, I'll pay up front. Maybe then the widow will cook for me too. Wonder what else she'd do for a man who—" The chair scraped against the wooden floor as Caleb stood. The room went quiet. Every head turned. Grady twisted in his seat, the grin fading from his face as he saw who stood behind him. Close enough to touch. "Mercer?" His voice lost some of its swagger. Didn't see you there. Caleb stepped forward. 1 step, 2. He stopped an arm's length from the table, close enough to see the sweat beading at Grady's hairline, the nervous flicker in his bloodshot eyes. You'll speak of her with respect. His voice came out low, steady, cold as creek water in January. Or you won't speak of her at all. Grady's throat bobbed. His eyes flicked to the other men at the table, looking for backup. Peters had found something fascinating in his cards. Tom Whitfield was studying the ceiling. Jake Brennan just shook his head slowly, lips pressed thin. Now hold on. Grady started, raising his hands. We were just talking. Men talk. Don't mean nothing. I heard what you said. Caleb didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Every word. The silence stretched like wire pulled too tight. Someone coughed near the bar. The bartender had stopped polishing glasses, his hand frozen on the rag, watching with the careful stillness of a man who'd seen this go bad before. I didn't mean nothing by it, Grady muttered. His eyes dropped to the cards scattered in front of him, unable to hold Caleb's stare. Just talk. Just passing time. Then stop talking. About her. About me. About anything you don't know for certain. Caleb let each word land like a stone dropped in still water. You understand me? Grady nodded once, quick and jerky. His face had gone pale beneath the stubble. Caleb held the stare for another long moment. Then he turned, dropped a coin on his table for the whiskey, and walked out into the afternoon sun. His hands were shaking. He gripped the porch railing, took a breath that wouldn't fill his lungs, took another. The rage drained out of him slowly, leaving something worse in its place, a cold, spreading dread that started in his gut and worked its way outward. They were talking. The whole town was talking. And he'd just made it worse, standing up for her like that, in front of everyone, making it clear she mattered enough to defend. Now they'd have proof. Now they'd have something real to chew on. The widow and the cowboy. Caleb Mercer defending her honor in the saloon. By nightfall, it would be all over town. By Sunday, Mrs. Patterson would be whispering about it in the church pews, her voice carrying just far enough to do damage. By next week, Clara's reputation would be shredded beyond repair. Because of him. He unhitched his horse, the blacksmith could wait, and rode out of town without looking back. That night, he sat alone in his cabin, staring at the 2 plates still set on the table. Tuesday was tomorrow. Clara would come with her basket, her bread, her smile that made him forget he'd ever been lonely. She'd sit across from him and ask about his week, and he'd have to look her in the eye knowing what he'd done, knowing that every moment they spent together gave the town more ammunition to use against her. He should tell her. Warn her about the talk. Give her the choice to walk away before the damage spread too far. That would be the decent thing. But decent would mean watching her go. The fire burned low. The lamp guttered and died. Caleb sat in the darkness. And by the time dawn crept through the windows, he'd made his decision. Tuesday came gray and cool. Autumn settling into the valley like a guest who intended to stay. Caleb left the cabin early, before Clara could arrive. He rode out to the north pasture, checked fences that didn't need checking, counted cattle that hadn't moved in days. When the sun climbed toward noon, he kept riding. She would come. She would find the cabin dark, the door locked, no coffee warming on the stove. She would wait. Maybe. the way she'd waited the night she first came. And then she would leave. It was better this way. He told himself that as the hours passed. Better for her, better for Molly. The town would lose interest if there was nothing to see. The whispers would die down. Clara could go back to her sewing, her quiet life, her reputation intact. He didn't return until well after dark. The cabin stood silent, exactly as he'd left it. No lamp in the window, no smoke from the chimney. He lit the stove, made coffee he didn't want, sat at the table with the 2 plates still in front of him, mocking him with what they meant. Wednesday passed. Thursday, Friday. Caleb avoided town, avoided the mercantile, avoided anywhere he might see her face or hear her name. The silence pressed in on him, heavier than before, now that he knew exactly what he was missing. On Saturday morning, low on supplies he couldn't put off any longer, he rode to the mercantile. Hank Taylor stood behind the counter, same as always, but something had changed in his expression. He rang up the flour, the coffee, the salt, without his usual chatter about weather or cattle prices. "Haven't seen you around," Hank said finally, sliding the goods across the counter. "Been busy, I'm sure." Caleb gathered his things, headed for the door. "She waited for you." Hank's voice stopped him cold. "Tuesday. Sat on your porch for 2 hours. Wrapped in that old shawl of hers, then rode home alone in the dark." Caleb's hand froze on the door handle. He didn't turn around. "Came by here Wednesday." Hank continued, his voice harder now. "Asked if I knew what happened, if you were hurt, or sick, or called away sudden. What did you tell her?" "Told her I didn't know." Hank's boots creaked on the floorboards as he moved closer. "Which was the truth? I don't know what's going on in that head of yours, Caleb. But that woman drove home alone in the dark, and she looked about as lost as I've ever seen anyone look." The words landed like blows against his back. Caleb stood there, hand still gripping the door, unable to move. "I'm protecting her," he said finally. The words came out hollow, even to his own ears. "From what exactly?" "The talk. What people are saying. What they'll keep saying as long as I'm around." Hank was quiet for a moment. "Then, son, people are going to talk no matter what you do. That's what people do in a town this size. They talk because their own lives aren't interesting enough to keep them busy. The only question that matters is whether you give them something worth talking about." The door swung shut behind Caleb. He loaded his supplies onto his horse, mounted up, and rode out of town with Hank's words ringing in his ears. But as he crested the hill and his cabin came into view, dark, cold, empty as a broken promise, one thought kept circling through his mind. Clara had waited. For 2 hours. In the gathering dark, and he hadn't even told her why. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Caleb stopped shaving, stopped changing his shirt. He ate beans cold from the can because lighting the stove felt like too much effort. The cabin smelled of unwashed clothes and stale coffee, and something else, the sour scent of a man who'd stopped caring whether he lived or rotted. Saturday afternoon. He couldn't find a clean shirt. He stood in front of the trunk at the foot of his bed, digging through wool blankets and old canvas work clothes, searching for something that didn't reek of his own neglect. His hands closed on fabric soft, worn, familiar, in a way that made his fingers go still. Not a shirt, A nightgown. White cotton, yellowed with age. Lace trim unraveling at the collar. Sarah's nightgown. He'd buried her in her Sunday dress. Couldn't bear to bury this too. So he'd folded it and tucked it away and tried to forget it existed. His fingers shook. He lifted the fabric to his face without thinking, pressing it against his nose, searching for some trace of her scent. Nothing. Just dust and cedar and 8 years of trying to forget. Something clattered in the trunk. He reached deeper and found it a hairbrush. Horsehair bristles set in a silver handle. Tarnished now, dulled by neglect. Sarah's initials were engraved on the back. S.E.M. Sarah Ellen Mercer. He'd given it to her as a wedding gift. She'd laughed, said it was too fine for a rancher's wife, said she'd ruin it within a month. But she'd used it every night, sitting at the edge of their bed, brushing her hair in long, slow strokes while he pretended to read by lamplight. He'd never told her how much he loved watching her do that, never found the words. The brush weighed nothing in his hand. His whole body shook so hard he nearly dropped it. He sank onto the bed. The brush clutched against his chest. The nightgown pooled in his lap, white cotton spilling over his knees like snow. His breath came short, ragged. His eyes burned with something he'd held back for 8 years. Sarah. 22 years old when she died. 22 years old and 9 months heavy with their child. And the doctor had said everything was fine. And the midwife had said the same. And then the bleeding started and wouldn't stop, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch. He'd held her hand while she went, felt her fingers go slack in his, heard the silence where there should have been a baby's first cry. The doctor wrapped them both in the same sheet, mother and son, together, and Caleb dug the grave himself, out on the hill behind the church, in ground so frozen he'd broken 2 shovels before he hit deep enough. 8 years. 8 years of waking up alone, eating alone, working himself to exhaustion just so he could fall asleep without thinking. He'd built walls around himself so high and thick that he'd forgotten there was anything worth protecting on the other side. And then Clara Dunn walked into his kitchen and set 2 plates on the table. And he'd pushed her away, just like he'd pushed everyone away, just like he always did. The tears came without warning, hot, shameful, unstoppable. He bent double on the edge of the bed, the brush pressed to his forehead, his shoulders heaving with sounds he didn't recognize as his own. He cried like a child lost in the dark, like a man who'd held everything in for so long the dam had finally burst. Snot ran down his lip. Spit gathered at the corners of his mouth. His chest cramped with the force of it, muscles seizing, lungs burning for air he couldn't seem to pull in. He slid off the bed. His knees hit the floor hard. He curled forward, forehead touching the cold planks. The brush still clutched in his fist, like it could bring her back if he just held on tight enough. This was what he'd become. A man on his knees in a filthy cabin, crying over a hairbrush, too broken to stand up and too stubborn to ask for help. 42 years old, and nothing to show for it but an empty house and a reputation for keeping to himself. He didn't hear the knock. The door opened. Boots on the threshold. Caleb looked up, face wet and swollen, snot smeared across his cheek where he'd tried to wipe it with his sleeve. The brush was still in his hand. The nightgown lay tangled on the floor beside him. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd fallen apart and didn't know how to put himself back together. Hank Taylor stood in the doorway, a battered hammer in one hand. His expression frozen somewhere between shock and something that looked uncomfortably like pity. Neither man moved. "Came to return your hammer," Hank said finally. His voice came out rough, uncertain. "You left it at my place last month." Caleb's throat worked. He couldn't speak, couldn't stand, could barely breathe. "I didn't lend you a hammer." "I know." Hank stepped inside, closed the door behind him. "But I needed a reason to come check on you." He crossed to the table, set the hammer down, and pulled out a chair. Sat without being invited. His eyes moved over the cabin, the cold stove, the unwashed dishes, the empty cans piled by the door, the 2 plates still sitting on the table where they'd sat for weeks like some kind of accusation. "You look like something the dogs wouldn't drag in," Hank said. Caleb wiped his face with his sleeve again. The gesture only made it worse, spreading the mess around like a child who'd been caught crying behind the schoolhouse. He managed to push himself up off the floor, legs unsteady, and drop into the chair across from Hank. His hands trembled on the table. He couldn't make them stop. "Clara came to see me." Hank's voice was quiet now, careful. "Asked if she'd done something to offend you. If there was some reason you'd stopped coming around." The words hit like stones dropped in still water. Caleb felt their weight spread through him, ripples of shame reaching places he'd thought were already numb. "What did you tell her? Told her I didn't know?" Hank leaned back in the chair, arms crossed over his chest. "Because I didn't. All I knew was a woman had come into your life for the first time in 8 years. And instead of holding on with both hands, you're sitting here in the dark, crying over a hairbrush. I'm protecting her." The words scraped out of his throat like glass. "From the talk, from what people are saying." "I know what people are saying." Hank cut him off, voice going hard. "I've got ears, but you're not protecting her. Caleb, you're protecting yourself. That's not... It is..." Hank leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes steady and unblinking. "You're protecting yourself from having to feel again, from having to take a risk, from having to open up that chest you nailed shut 8 years ago and let somebody see what's inside." Caleb's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His hands curled into fists, the brush digging into his palm hard enough to leave marks. "I did the same thing," Hank said, softer now. "After Martha passed, told myself I was being strong, noble, a man who didn't need anyone or anything. You know what I got for 20 years of that?" Caleb didn't answer. "Nothing." Hank's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. 20 years of eating alone, sleeping alone, talking to customers because they were the only people who had to listen to me. I told myself it was easier. And it was. But easier ain't living. Son, easier is just waiting around to die." The words hung in the air like smoke. Caleb stared at the brush in his hand. The tarnished silver, the faded initials of a woman who'd been gone longer than they'd been married. "I don't know how to be anything else," he said finally. His voice cracked on the last word, splintering apart. "I've been alone so long I've forgotten." "You think Clara doesn't know that?" Hank pushed back from the table, chair legs scraping against the floor. "You think she hasn't figured out you're scared half to death of wanting something you might lose? That woman buried her husband and moved her whole life to a town where she didn't know a single soul. She's scared too. The difference is she's brave enough to knock on your door anyway." Caleb's throat sealed shut. He couldn't speak. "You want to spend the next 20 years like me." Hank walked to the door, pulled it open. Late afternoon light spilled across the floor, harsh and unforgiving. "Fine. Sit here in the dark. Hold on to that brush. Tell yourself you're being noble while Clara finds someone who ain't too much of a coward to love her." The word landed like a slap. Coward. Caleb's head snapped up, a flash of anger cutting through the shame. "I'm not," "Then prove it." Hank stepped through the doorway, pausing on the threshold. "She asked me once if you were a good man. I told her you were. Don't make me a liar." "Caleb?" The door closed, boots on the porch, then silence. Caleb sat alone in the wreckage of his cabin, the wreckage of his life. The brush dug into his palm. The nightgown lay crumpled on the floor where it had fallen. He folded it slowly, hands still trembling, and tucked it back into the trunk, closed the lid. 20 years alone. That's what waited for him if he kept walking this road. 20 years of cold suppers and dark rooms, and talking to his horse because there was no one else. 20 years of watching from a distance while Clara built a life he could have been part of. His eyes moved to the table. 2 plates. He'd set them there the night Clara first came. Hadn't put them away since. The second plate had been a question, a hope he didn't know he still carried. And Clara had been answering it. Every Tuesday, every pot of stew, every loaf of bread, every evening reading by the fire. She'd been answering it all along. He'd just been too scared to hear her. Caleb stood. His knees still ached from hitting the floor. His face felt raw, swollen, ugly. He looked like a man who'd lost a fight with himself. He set the brush on the table, next to the plates. Then he crossed to the washstand, poured water into the basin, and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. Red eyes, blotched skin, a week's worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. He looked like a man who'd given up on everything, including himself. He reached for the razor, but as he lifted it to his face, one question burned through his mind. After everything, the silence, the distance, the weeks of letting her wonder what she'd done wrong, would Clara even want to see him again? The razor scraped down his jaw, pulling away stubble and dead skin and something else, the mask he'd been wearing for weeks. Caleb worked slow, methodical, watching his reflection emerge from the wreck he'd become. The water in the basin turned gray with grime. He emptied it twice, refilled it, kept going until the man in the mirror looked almost human again. His hands had stopped shaking. That surprised him. After everything, the breakdown, Hank's words, the shame of being found on his knees crying like a child, his hands held steady on the blade. Maybe there was something left in him after all, some piece that hadn't completely rotted away in 8 years of darkness. He dried his face with a clean rag. The skin underneath felt raw, exposed, new. The blue chambray shirt hung where he'd left it weeks ago, pressed flat under his saddle. He pulled it on, buttoned it to the collar, tucked it into his cleanest trousers. The leather vest came next, stiff from disuse, but it still fit. He brushed his boots with the same rag, knocking off the worst of the neglect. In the cracked mirror, a different man looked back. Not young, not handsome, but clean, presentable. Someone a woman might not be ashamed to be seen standing next to. The sun hung low when he saddled his horse, casting long shadows across the yard. He mounted up and turned toward town. And for the first time in weeks, he didn't lie to himself about why. Elm Street lay quiet in the fading light. Most folks were inside finishing supper, clearing tables, settling in for the evening. Caleb reined his horse to a stop at Clara's gate. The white picket fence he'd noticed needed painting. The crooked post he'd thought about fixing and never had. The cottage windows glowed warm with lamplight. Through the glass, he could see movement, shadows passing back and forth. The ordinary motion of a home with people in it, living their lives, going about their evening as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis. He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence, stood there with his hat in his hands, boots rooted to the hard-packed dirt. Unable to make himself move. What was he going to say? He'd rehearsed words on the ride over, practiced explanations and apologies and reasons until his throat went dry. They all sounded hollow now. Empty phrases that couldn't begin to cover what he'd done. The front door opened. Molly stood on the porch, arms crossed tight against her chest, watching him with eyes that could cut glass. She wore her everyday dress, flour dusting her sleeves, an apron tied crooked at her waist. "Mr. Mercer?" Miss Molly. She didn't move from the doorway, didn't invite him closer, just stood there, blocking the entrance like a guard at a fortress gate. And Caleb understood he'd have to get past her before he could get to Clara. "Mama cried." Molly's voice came flat, matter-of-fact, stripped of everything but the truth. "After you stopped coming, she didn't let me see, but I heard her at night. Through the wall between our rooms." The words hit him like a fist to the gut. He gripped his hat tighter, the brim crumpling under his fingers. "I know." "Do you?" Molly's chin lifted, her jaw set in a line that reminded him painfully of her mother. "Do you know what it's like to watch your mother pretend she's fine when she's not? To see her set the table for 3 people and then have to put the 3rd plate away because nobody's coming?" "Molly?" Clara's voice came from inside, sharp with warning. "Let the man speak his piece." Molly held Caleb's gaze for another long moment, measuring him, judging him, finding him wanting. Then she stepped aside and disappeared into the cottage without another word. Clara appeared in the doorway. She wore her blue calico, the one he'd watched her touch at the mercantile all those weeks ago. Her hair was pinned up neat, a few strands loose around her face the way they always came loose by evening. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers interlaced, knuckles white with the force of her grip. She didn't smile, didn't move toward him, just stood there in the doorway of her home, waiting for him to explain himself. Caleb's throat closed. All the words he'd practiced on the ride over vanished like smoke, leaving nothing but the raw and ragged truth. "I ran," he said. His voice came out rough, cracked down the middle. "When things got hard, when people started talking, I ran. That's what I do. That's what I've always done." Clara said nothing. 8 years ago, my wife died." The words scraped out of him like stones dragged across gravel. "Sarah, she was 22 years old. She was having our baby, and something went wrong, and the doctor couldn't stop the bleeding." Clara's hands tightened against each other. Her expression didn't change. I held her hand while she went, felt her fingers go slack in mine. Caleb's eyes burned, but he forced himself to keep talking, to get it all out before the courage left him. They buried them together, mother and son. I dug the grave myself because I couldn't stand the thought of anyone else doing it. A muscle twitched in Clara's jaw. She stayed silent, giving him nothing. After that, I stopped. Caleb gripped his hat with both hands now, twisting the brim like a man wringing out a rag. Stopped talking, stopped feeling. Built myself a life where nothing could touch me because I didn't let anything get close enough to try. 8 years. Clara? 8 years of telling myself that emptiness was the same as strength. The evening light caught Clara's eyes wet, but steady. She didn't wipe them. Then you walked into my kitchen. Caleb's voice broke. He didn't try to hide it. You set 2 plates on my table like it was the most natural thing in the world. You sat across from me and ate supper like we'd been doing it for years. And I remembered what I'd been missing, what I'd been hiding from. He stepped forward. 1 step. 2. Stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. I pushed you away because you scared me, because you made me feel things I thought were dead and buried. And I told myself I was protecting you, protecting your reputation, being noble, doing the right thing. He shook his head, but I wasn't. I was protecting myself from having to try again, from having to risk losing someone again. Clara's chin trembled, just once, barely visible. Then it steadied. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Caleb said. I'm not asking for anything I don't deserve. I just needed you to know that it wasn't you. It was never you. It was me. It's always been me. Silence settled between them. The evening sounds filled the gap, a dog barking somewhere down the street, a wagon creaking past on the main road, the distant lowing of cattle being driven home for the night. Clara descended the porch steps, one at a time, slow and deliberate. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could smell the flour on her apron, the soap she used in her hair, the faint warmth of the kitchen clinging to her clothes. You think I don't know about fear? Her voice was quiet, controlled, but something burned beneath the surface. You think I haven't spent the last 2 years lying awake, wondering if I made the right choice, moving here, starting over, trying to build something from nothing, with a daughter who lost her father and a heart that forgot how to hope? Caleb didn't answer, couldn't. I was terrified the night I came to your cabin. Clara's eyes held his, unwavering. Terrified you'd turn me away. Terrified I was being forward, presumptuous, desperate for something I had no right to ask for. But I knocked anyway, because I was more afraid of spending the rest of my life alone than I was of being rejected by a man I barely knew. Her hand reached out, touched his forearm. The contact burned through his shirt like a brand pressed to bare skin. I'm not asking for promises. Caleb, I'm not asking for a ring or a future or anything you're not ready to give. Her fingers tightened on his arm. I'm just asking you to be here, to stop running, to let me in far enough to see what's really there. His throat sealed shut. Words wouldn't come. Can you do that? He looked at her at the lines around her eyes that spoke of years of worry, the strength in her jaw that spoke of years of carrying on alone, the vulnerability she wasn't trying to hide because she trusted him enough to let him see it. He looked at the cottage behind her, the lamp-lit windows, the life she'd built from nothing but determination and hope. He thought about the 2 plates on his table, the question they'd been asking for weeks. I don't know how, he said honestly. I don't know how to be anything but alone. But I want to try, if you'll let me. Clara's hand slid down his arm. Her fingers found his, interlaced, held tight. That's all I'm asking. The door creaked behind them. They both turned. Molly stood on the porch, her expression unreadable, her arms no longer crossed. She looked at their joined hands, then at her mother's face, then at Caleb. "Supper's getting cold," she said. Her voice was flat, neutral, but something had shifted in her eyes, some wall coming down, some judgment being reserved. "There's enough for 3. Clara glanced at Caleb. A question. "If there's a plate for me," he said. Molly's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "There's always been a plate for you, Mr. Mercer. Mama just stopped setting it out when you didn't come." She turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind her. Clara squeezed Caleb's hand once, then let go. She climbed the porch steps, paused at the threshold. Coming. He hung his hat on the fence post, climbed the steps, crossed the threshold into the warmth and light and smell of food cooking in a home with people in it. The kitchen was small and bright, the table set for 3. Molly was already seated, hands folded, waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait for things that mattered. Caleb pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, looked at the plate in front of him, plain white ceramic, a small chip on the rim and something loosened in his chest that had been clenched tight for 8 years. "Mr. Mercer?" Molly's voice cut through the quiet. "Will you say grace?" He looked up. Clara had taken her seat, her hands folded, her eyes on his. "I'm out of practice," he said. The same words he'd spoken the first time. "Then practice," Clara said softly. Caleb bowed his head. The words came slow, rusty, dragged up from some forgotten place deep inside him. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for the hands that made it, for the company we share." He paused, searching for what came next. "And for second chances. Amen." Amen. Clara and Molly echoed together. They ate. They talked. The food was good, the conversation better. And when Caleb rode home that night, a basket of bread tucked under his arm and Clara's smile burned into his memory. He understood that something had changed. But he also knew that one supper didn't undo weeks of silence. One apology didn't rebuild trust that had been broken. The road ahead was long, and he still wasn't sure he knew how to walk it. The weeks that followed moved like water, finding its level slow, inevitable, settling into places that had been empty for too long. Caleb showed up at Clara's cottage every Sunday after church. Sometimes he brought honey from old Samuel Pratt, sometimes wildflowers picked from the meadow behind his cabin. Once a length of ribbon he'd spotted at the mercantile and bought without letting himself think too hard about why. Molly teased him about the ribbon, said it was the wrong shade of blue for her mother's coloring, but Clara wore it in her hair the following week. And that was answer enough. Tuesday visits resumed. Clara arrived at his cabin with her basket and her bread and her quiet presence that made the rooms feel larger somehow, fuller, like they'd been waiting for her all along. They talked. They played cards. Some evenings she read aloud from that worn leather book while he whittled by the fire, shaping chunks of cedar into things he didn't recognize until they were finished. A bird with its wings spread. A horse mid-gallop. A small figure of a girl with her arms crossed and her chin raised. He gave that last one to Molly without explanation. She didn't say thank you, that wasn't her way, but she set it on the windowsill above her bed where the morning light would catch it. He noticed it there the next time he came to supper. The church bells rang on a Sunday in early November, and Caleb walked through the doors for the first time in 8 years. He'd polished his boots until they held a shine, worn his blue chambray, pressed flat, tucked crisp into clean trousers. His hat sat in his hands as he found a pew near the back, sliding in beside Clara and Molly with a nod that carried more weight than words ever could. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through tall grass. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Tom Whitfield nudged his wife with his elbow. Bill Grady, seated 3 rows up, didn't turn around at all, just hunched lower in his seat and kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. Caleb kept his own eyes forward. Clara's hand found his on the pew between them, hidden from view by the folds of her Sunday skirt. Her fingers were warm, steady, certain. The preacher spoke about forgiveness, about the grace that found people in their darkest hours and led them toward light they'd stopped believing existed. Caleb listened with half an ear, his attention fixed on the warmth of Clara's palm against his, the steady rhythm of her pulse where their wrists touched. When the service ended, Hank Taylor caught his eye from across the aisle. The old man nodded once, slow, deliberate, approving, then turned and shuffled out into the November sun without a word. Some things didn't need saying. The whispers continued as they walked out, but something had shifted in their tone. Softer now. Curious instead of cruel. By the time Caleb helped Clara and Molly into their wagon for the ride home, the word had spread through the congregation like flame through dry kindling. The widow and the cowboy, sitting together in church, holding hands where anyone could see. Let them talk, Caleb thought as he mounted his own horse. Let them say whatever they wanted to say. He was done hiding from people whose opinions had never mattered to begin with. The first hard frost came a week later. Caleb rode out at dawn to check his fence line and found a whole section down. Posts rotted through. Wire sagging useless in the frozen mud. A day's work at minimum. Maybe 2 if the ground fought him. He'd need supplies from town. And he'd have to camp out on the range to finish before the weather turned worse. He stopped at Clara's cottage on his way out of town. 2 days, he said, standing at her gate in the gray morning light. Maybe 3. Fence won't hold through winter otherwise. Clara stood on her porch, a wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders against the cold. Molly had already left for school, her books bundled under her arm, her breath fogging in the chill air. Be careful out there. Always am. He tipped his hat and turned his horse toward the road. Her voice stopped him before he'd gone 3 steps. Caleb? He looked back. Come home safe. The words hung in the cold air between them. Come home. Not back to his cabin. Not back from the range. Home. He nodded once, not trusting his voice, and rode out before she could see what her words had done to his face. The fence took 3 days. Caleb worked from first light until his arms shook and his hands bled through his work gloves, digging post holes in ground that had frozen solid overnight, stretching wire until his shoulders screamed for rest. At night, he slept under stars so bright they hurt to look at, wrapped in his bedroll beside a fire that never quite kept the cold at bay. He thought about Sarah, about the grave on the hill behind the church, the headstone he hadn't visited in longer than he could remember. He thought about the life they might have had, the son who would have been 8 years old by now, learning to ride and rope and read cattle brands, learning all the things Caleb had planned to teach him. The grief was still there. It would always be there. He understood now. Woven into the fabric of who he was. As much a part of him as the calluses on his hands or the lines around his eyes, but it had changed shape somewhere along the way. Softened at the edges, made room for something else to grow alongside it. On the third morning, he drove the last post, strung the last wire, and mounted up for the long ride back. His horse picked up the pace without being asked, eager for warm shelter and the bucket of oats waiting at journey's end. Caleb let him have his head. His cabin appeared over the ridge as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb reined his horse to a stop and sat there in the saddle, watching. Light glowed warm in the windows, amber and gold, spilling out into the gathering dusk. The sight of it struck him somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he'd thought had gone numb years ago. His hand didn't move toward his holster. His pulse didn't spike with alarm or suspicion. He knew who was inside, and this time, he smiled before he even reached the gate. He dismounted at the fence, tied off his horse, walked toward the porch with steps that felt lighter than they had in years. The boards creaked beneath his boots, the same boards that had announced his return to an empty house, more times than he could count. The door handle was cold against his palm. He pushed it open. Clara stood at the stove, stirring something in his grandmother's Dutch oven. The smell of beef stew filled the cabin, rich and savory, and laced with rosemary. Exactly the way his wife used to make it. She wore her blue calico, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, an apron tied neat at her waist. At the table, Molly was setting out plates. 3 of them. 3 glasses. 3 sets of silverware laid out straight and proper on the worn wooden surface. They both looked up when he entered. "Welcome home," Clara said. Caleb stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. His throat worked. No words came. Molly pulled out his chair, at the head of his own table. "Supper's almost ready. You look half frozen. Sit down before you fall down." He crossed to the washstand like a man moving through a dream, poured water into the basin, watched the trail dust swirl and dissolve. 3 days of hard work, washing down the drain. In the cracked mirror, his reflection looked back at him tired, weathered, older than he remembered being, but there was something new in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He dried his hands, turned. Clara had ladled stew into the bowls. Steam rose between them, fragrant and warm. She took her seat across from Molly, leaving the chair at the head of the table empty, waiting for him. Caleb hung his hat on the hook by the door, the same hook where it had hung for 20 years. Always alone, always coming back to silence. He walked to the table and sat down. The chair fit him. The table felt right. The faces looking back at him, one woman, one girl, both watching with quiet expectation, filled spaces he'd forgotten were empty. "Mr. Mercer?" Molly said. "Grace." He bowed his head. The words came easier now, worn smooth by practice. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for safe travels and warm fires, for the people who wait when we're gone." He paused. "And for the courage to come home. Amen. Amen." Clara and Molly echoed. They ate. They talked. Molly described her lessons at school, the boy who'd pulled her braid and gotten his ears boxed for it, the book about pioneers she was reading for her composition class. Clara asked about the fence, the weather, whether he'd seen wolves on the range. Caleb answered between bites, his voice rough but growing steadier with each word. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, he walked Clara and Molly to their wagon, helped them up onto the seat, stood watching as they drove off into the dark, Clara's lantern swaying with the motion. A small point of light growing smaller until it rounded the bend and disappeared. Spring came slow to the valley, melting in patches, revealing brown grass and muddy roads beneath retreating snow. Caleb spent a week building the second rocking chair. The wood came from a fallen oak he'd found on the North Range, good hardwood with tight grain, the kind that would last longer than he would. He shaped the runners by hand, carved the armrests smooth, sanded every surface until it gleamed pale in the afternoon light. The chair sat on his porch now, beside the one he'd always used, waiting. Clara came on a Tuesday afternoon, sewing basket over her arm. She paused at the top of the porch steps, looking at the new chair, then at Caleb, who sat in the old one, whittling a piece of cedar into something that might become a horse. "You made this? Had some time?" She set down her basket, ran her hand along the armrest, testing the smoothness. Then she settled into the seat with a sigh that spoke of long days and tired feet and the simple pleasure of sitting down. They rocked in silence. The creek sang behind them, swollen with snowmelt. Birds called from the new-leafed trees. Molly sat on the porch steps with her book, reading aloud, her voice rising and falling with the story. "Caleb." He looked over. Clara's eyes were on the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent. Her profile caught the golden light, softening the lines around her eyes. "Did you ever think this would happen? Any of it?" He considered the question, thought about the 2 plates he'd set on his table that first night and never put away, the empty chair, the silence he'd learned to live with because he thought there was no other choice. "No," he said finally. "But I kept the second plate out every day for 8 years. Clara turned to look at him. "Why?" The answer came slow, dredged up from somewhere deep. "I suppose some part of me still believed, even when the rest of me had given up." Clara smiled, reached across the space between their chairs. Her hand found his, warm and certain. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They sat together on the porch he'd built, in the chairs he'd made, listening to Molly read about pioneers and promises and new beginnings. The sun sank lower. The shadows grew long. And somewhere in the cabin behind them, 2 plates sat on the table, waiting for supper. The second plate was no longer a question. It was an answer. There is something quiet that stays with us after a story like this. A weight that is not heavy. Exactly. But tender. The kind that settles somewhere in the chest and asks nothing of us except to be held for a moment longer. Many of us have known what it is to sit alone at a table set for one. Some of us have kept an empty chair, not because we expected anyone to fill it, but because putting it away felt too much like surrender. Perhaps you have loved someone from a careful distance, or been loved without ever quite knowing it, or waited in the dark for a knock that never came, and then, one evening, it did. These things do not need to be explained or understood. They are allowed to simply be. It is all right to carry them quietly, the way we carry so many things, the losses, the almost was, the finally enough. They do not need to be resolved tonight. And so the story rests here, not with answers, but with the simple knowledge that we sat together for a while, you and I, sharing something that mattered. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening.